there really is nothing quite as great as hindsight when you're talking about history. And so it's very, very common practice, very popular practice to say, oh, I would have done this if I were in command of so and so force. I would have done that. Most common thing you see with a matchup between two battleships is, oh, I would have made the best possible use of my advantages, knowing full well the weaknesses and limitations of the opposing ship or the opposing force. But really, the question isn't what would you do, it's what would the individuals in charge of the actual ships have done in that situation, which can be very, very different based on what they knew and what they didn't know at the time. Such is the case a lot of the time with a matchup between Iowa and Yamato, with people saying that if they were in command of Iowa, they would have obviously opened the range up to a range where the US radar-based fire control would be able to land very accurate hits on Yamato, and Yamato would not have been able to reply unless you were using her seaplanes, and even then with poor accuracy. But is this what would have actually happened in 1943 or 44 when those two ships could possibly have come into contact? No. And most of this is based on what the US Navy knew about Yamato at the time. Most importantly, her armor scheme and, of course, her armament. I think everyone knows that the US Navy was not aware that the Yamato had the 18-inch or 460mm guns. Those guns were assumed to be 16 inches. And that means that the projections for the penetration capability and the damage capacity of that ship would have been greatly underestimated. So what we do know is that the US Navy issued these documents that showed the immune zones of their own ships compared to various possible Japanese adversaries. An immune zone, as the name implies, is the zone wherein a ship is immune to enemy fire. It's capped on both ends. One on the lower end, it's capped by the lack of side belt armor sufficient to stop a close-range shot, and on the long side, it's capped by the fact that deck armor is substantial, but still not quite enough to stop a 1-ton projectile falling at a very steep angle. And then in between, you have the range where the drop angle of the shell is not quite enough to penetrate the deck armor or just wouldn't hit the deck armor, and far away enough from the firing ship that the shell slows down enough because of air resistance and stuff, and would lack the punching power to penetrate the side belt. So let's have a look and see what the US Navy thought of the Yamato. And this is exactly what Strafford Morss did in 1986 in Volume 23, Number 2 of Warship International. That's almost 30 years ago. No, it's more than 30 years ago, and he had access to this information. So what you're seeing here is a diagram showing the immune zones of the Massachusetts against the Yamato and vice versa, which, as far as we know, was present in actuality in 1944-1945 aboard the Massachusetts, which is a South Dakota class battleship, more or less with the same kind of armor scheme as the Iowas. But was this accurate? No, not really. So this is what the actual immune zone looks like. So what you're seeing here is a diagram showing the immune zone of Iowa versus the Yamato, and it's obviously not based off real data, but based off projections done in the 80s, in 86. And to clarify, the shaded part shows where the ship would be penetrated, which means that Iowa is getting penetrated all the way from around 27,000 yards down to point-blank range. And that means that the immune zone of Iowa is less than 10,000 yards. It's less than 5,000 yards. It's tiny, whereas the immune zone of Yamato is huge, going all the way out from 15,000 to around 33,000 yards. Now, 32 to 33,000 yards, by the way, just happens to also be roughly the range at which Yamato hit the White Plains off Samar in 44. So, it's possible that if that hit had struck the Iowa instead, it'd be pretty bad damage. But the question is, why is this even important? Well, the answer is because this kind of information, this intelligence that was available to the captains at the time, will inform the actual tactics that would have been used had these two come into conflict. So Morss addresses this and says that, of course, at the start of the engagement, the Iowa or the New Jersey or any of the Iowa-class battleships would have opened fire at extreme range using their radar-controlled fire control, as doctrine called for at the time. But what would they have done once they realized that not only had they underestimated Yamato, but Yamato could reach out and return fire at that range? So Morss points out these three things that would have weighed in on any competent captain's decision to close the range or keep the range open. Number one, Iowa and most ships, because of the limitations of deck armor, are vulnerable to plunge and fire at ranges exceeding 30,000 yards. Number two, the fact that just because of the sheer distances involved, even with superb fire control, it takes a long time to achieve any number of decent hits against an enemy ship. And number three, the Washington back in 42 was not able to sink Hiroshima for a long time. In fact, it wasn't at all able. It had to be scuttled later on. So Morss argues that this combination of factors would have caused any competent captain in charge of the battleship line to close the range, because they would have thought, based on the intelligence available at the time, that the Iowa or the South Dakota's immune range was much greater than it actually was. And so it would have been sitting in a much closer range, where the U.S. Navy captain in charge would have thought, based on intelligence available at the time, that the Iowa or the South Dakota was in its immune zone, but it would not have been. And conversely, might have thought that the Iowa or South Dakota would have been able to penetrate Yamato, when in reality, this would not have been the case. And Morss also cites a handwritten note on a table for the Japanese battleships present on the Massachusetts. Quote, on the basis of penetration only, battleships 11 through 14, best ranges 30,000 to 15,000. BB-11 was Yamato. Morss continues that Iowa's closing the range to 20,000 yards, still within her anticipated immunity zone, would have in fact played to Yamato's strength. Inside of 26,000 yards, Iowa was vulnerable to side penetration by Yamato, but could not return side penetration in return. Now, of course, Morss personally ends the paper by saying that he still thinks that the Iowa was a better ship overall, which is a fair opinion, and that if these two had come into conflict, then both of them would have left with too much damage to be useful by the end of the war in August of 45, which is also fair. But it's important to keep in mind that we don't get to use hindsight to enhance the tactical abilities of commanders at the time, and we have to consider what information was available to them and what they would have done with that information.